That was a very gracious introduction, by the way. Just an aside on that, I'm still working on the Francis Marion papers. We're probably up to maybe 700 so letters, thereabouts, and I'm still finding them, even though I thought I was all out of letters. I found 3 of them at the archives on Wednesday, so there's still, I guess there's still a lot of letters out there. I hope. So if anybody knows of anything off the wall, just let me know. I'll track them down. Based on the various things we've heard today, we pretty much seem to focus more on Francis Marion as the militia commander of the Swamp Hawks of the Revolution. We also do a little bit discussion about Francis Marion as the Continental officer. Not enough probably, but there is some mention of him. If you look at the various biographies, however, you'll pretty much come to the conclusion that his life, his active life, ended after the Revolution. There's maybe a one-page mention of him being in the Senate of South Carolina, and then gets married and passes over. That's kind of the end. But during the final months of the Revolution in 1782, we realized that he was also a member of the South Carolina Senate. And this was actually going to convene at Jacksonboro in January 1782. Very little was known about this or even mentioned in the history books, maybe it's because, I don't know, politics are boring or something. I don't really know why it isn't mentioned, because it is a pivotal point in South Carolina's history. So what I'm trying to do here is not only talk about the assembly itself, but just talk about Marion as the militia commander, as well as the civic leader that he was leading up to the Jacksonboro Assembly. So, give you a quick review. Governor Rutledge, back in April of 1780, leaves Charlestown because of the British threat of his siege. His Privy Council goes with him. Marion also leaves because he has his broken or sprained foot or ankle, depending on who you talk to. And a month later, Charleston Court surrenders. At that point in time, if we're looking at the governmental side of South Carolina, the government of South Carolina is effectively ended. Obviously, we have the British, but as far as the colonial government, it's gone, or the new government, the new American government, there is none. Shortly after that fall, well, we see that Rutledge eventually went to Philadelphia, just so we know where all our players went. The Privy Council itself, these are his advisors. 5 of them were imprisoned in St. Augustine, and 2 of them changed sides after the fall of Charlestown. This is pretty significant if you think about it, because this is like your Secretary of Defense and your Secretary of State all of a sudden deciding that they wanted to, that they were no longer part of the United States and they were, let's say, becoming Russian. That's about how intense it would be for Daniel UG and Charles Pinckney to change their allegiance. And then finally we have John Lewis Gervais, who was the one remaining counselor, and he went north. So basically, Rutledge, as governor, has one person he can lean on as far as his official government, and that's Gervais. Of course, we also have Francis Marion. He's out in the swamps recuperating, not really quite sure where he is, but he done service for us, at least until August that we know of. But from May till August of 1781, now we're talking about a whole almost 15 months. There is the British have the only law, official law, and that's basically only in Charlestown, and that's really a martial law. So anything that goes on there really isn't binding, would not be binding once the Americans would take charge. So as a result, if you think about it, outside of Charlestown, there is no law. Therefore, we have no official wills, we have no official marriages, property transactions, civil dispute resolutions, criminal. There's nothing going on. It would be pretty much chaos, as the war itself was. So we're basically just dealing with total chaos. But by mid-July, Green, perhaps trying to look ahead, maybe being a far-sighted fellow, he makes an overture to John Matthews, who is a member of the Continental Congress, and he writes him saying, "I wish an attempt could be made to establish civil government in South Carolina." Green is already looking perhaps toward, maybe he's a little premature in the sense that he thinks that perhaps his army will take the British sooner than they truly do. He didn't know, he's writing to Matthews, he knows, because he didn't really know where Rutledge was. Rutledge had been threatening to come south, but he kept getting delayed, and as a result, Rutledge is writing to, Green is writing to Matthews asking him, "I wish he would not delay a moment in coming here," knowing that another indication that Green is truly looking to get things moving. Of course, here's our Governor John Rutledge, who was probably one of the preeminent politicians and statesmen in South Carolina, who holds the government together, holds the state together in late 1781, 1782. He has been given the title of Dictator John before the legislature adjourned upon the siege of Charlestown. Legislature gave him basically unlimited powers. He could do anything he wanted to. I believe he just couldn't carry out any capital punishment. Other than that, Rutledge had the right to do anything he wanted to. He returns to South Carolina, arriving at Green's headquarters at the high hills of Santee. He immediately issues a proclamation indicating or strictly forbidding all persons from plundering. We've heard how plundering happened to be a really significant activity that was not really doing anyone any good, except those who were doing the plundering, perhaps. He also directed that all justices of the peace to execute their office bring justice to persons accused of any criminal offense. Rutledge is setting the stage for the establishment of the government. Now, one thing about the plundering aspect of things, and I think it's really important from let's say the social and the personal side, is that plundering had become an accepted practice. And by Rutledge issuing his proclamation, it was a clear refutation of Sumter's Law. Sumter's Law was a policy that was conceived by Thomas Sumter, and it was widely implemented policy that awarded a bounty of one slave to every recruit who would join Sumter's brigade. Basically, I don't know how aware you are, but there was a very, very difficult process of getting anyone to join the militias. And by 1781, the South Carolinians were pretty much, they were done fighting, just like they were everywhere else. In reality, up north, nobody wanted to fight anymore. So Sumter was doing probably about the only thing he really could come up with to entice people to join, and that was give them a bounty of a slave and see if they wouldn't join. Unfortunately, Marion himself did not agree with that policy initially. He later did, by the way, but he didn't initially. But unfortunately, Sumter's Law was a license to plunder. Unfortunately, you plunder both Loyalist and Patriot plantations. They really weren't too concerned. A lot of the patriots, militia that went out to gather up slaves and property. Sumter's Law had been approved by Greene, and it was later approved by Rutledge. However, once he was back in South Carolina, Rutledge said no. Rutledge also made the overtures about establishing a rudimentary government. This would be the criminal justice system, since we didn't have any to speak of. So he directs Marion, and I want you to just try to take notice of this. He's directing Marion. There's nobody else mentioned here but Marion, do this, Marion, do that, Marion, do this. In this case, Rutledge is requesting Marion to nominate JPs, Justices of the Peace, sheriffs, and ordinaries, which is another type, basically the ordinaries taking care of the administrative functions like wills and I guess there are other types of documents that were not of any criminal nature. Then later, Rutledge basically just says, go appoint the justice of the peace. He doesn't even wait to get the nominations to come back. He says, just go name these justices of the peace. Once again, an indication that Francis Marion was trusted. They knew he was a man of high integrity, and Rutledge just says, you know these people better than I do. Just go pick the right people to do the job and get it done. The other thing that started happening here was that now we're in September 1781. Now, we haven't even gotten to the assembly yet because there are a lot of things you have to do before you can even bring your assemblymen together. Rutledge, establishing his control, began the confiscation and protection of loyalist plantations. The actual British had been confiscating patriot plantations for the last year and a half. Rutledge himself is saying, now we're going to come back, we're going to confiscate and protect the loyalist plantations, as opposed to plundering them. At the same time, Marion was directed to send loyalist families to Charlestown. This is the reason here being that the loyalist families were using the supplies from the plantations. They were short supplied to begin with, send the loyalists back to Charlestown, and all of a sudden the British have more pressure on them to evacuate Charlestown because they have more mouths to feed. The continual process of supply, which is probably one of the things that really ended the war as fast as it did. He also began preparation of list of loyalists. Now this would be a precursor to the confiscation list that were developed about 6 months later, and I'll go into that in some detail. Other things that he did, the point in time that the Revolutionary War, the inflation was running rampant. There was no monetary controls. The currencies, there were like 3 or 4 different types of currency, and Rutledge just said he was just going to attempt to stabilize the currency, saying, hey, paper currency is out. The only currency you can use is specie, which is basically British silver. That's it. Nothing else. So all of a sudden, any transactions that were coming down in currency was ended. You might be able to trade for price or some kind of supplies, but that was pretty much under the table to begin with. Another thing that he did, which was very important for setting up for the future, because you think about these, a lot of these things that Rutledge is doing, he's setting up for the future. He realizes that the Americans are going to win. He wants to position South Carolina such that it can come out of the war and begin to recover from it, to grow. His third proclamation was, surprisingly enough, he was giving clemency to all loyalists who basically had not been obnoxious or had not been killers, but ones who had been had pledged their allegiance to the British crown. Which, if you think about that, at this point in time, pledging allegiance, they're giving the clemency is a pretty significant move. You can imagine this would make a lot of people really, really mad that the governor is going to forgive the crimes of a lot of people who have burned plantations, and even though they may have murdered some people, that would have to be proved anyhow. So there is another reason why Rutledge did this. Remember we talked about Sumter's Law and the fact that we're having trouble getting people in our army. This is a prime way to recruit. If you need some new people in your army, forgive the loyalists, have them come in and serve 6 months in the militia. All of a sudden now you've just added a ton of people to your army. Of course, we're assuming that these people are going to fight for you and not be ones that are going to shoot you in the back, but that's a chance that you take. And Rutledge was willing to take that chance because he knew that there are a lot of fair weather loyalists out there, a lot of fair weather patriots. People change their allegiance throughout the war. You may change 2 or 3 times during the war because of the pressure that was applied to you. Some of it was because of just the political pressure. Some was you're just trying to protect your family. Some of it is just really simple. If I swear allegiance to the British, my family will live. If I don't, my family might be killed, my plantation is burned, and my life as I know it is over. So I'm going to go ahead and pledge allegiance and hope that the British win. And if they don't, I hope that the new American government in South Carolina will forgive me. And basically, as you can see, Rutledge did. Marion, I mentioned to you about some of his functions. Now, don't forget, this is Francis Marion, who's the Brigadier General of the South Carolina Militia. He's got certain responsibilities as a military man. Now, you can see the functions that John Rutledge just dropped onto Marion. Don't forget the other thing, Francis Marion is almost 50 years old by this time, and not to say anything about the age issue, because I am over 50 myself, but 50 years old in 1780 is probably not the same as 50 years old right now. My guess is that you would be probably aged a little bit more, plus spending a lot of time out in the swamps of South Carolina. So Marion is nevertheless, you can see he's responsible for returning plundered property, for punishing plunderers. He's got to confiscate and manage these loyalist property. He's got to send loyalists to Charlestown. He's got to assist the magistrates. And at the same time, we have our disputes with our loyalists, or our loyalists up in the PD region. He has to deal with some issues up there that are ongoing because his commander up there his commander is known as a plantation burner himself. So we have to deal with those situations. And on top of that, we see Marion, September 1781. These are some of his military functions. These are some of his activities in that 2-month period. We heard about Parker's Ferry, where Marion rode 100 miles down to 8 Hardin, and those are 100 hard miles. He didn't have his new Camry. He was riding his horse on his 100-mile ride, which makes it 2 days. That's a pretty hard ride. I would not even think about doing that, especially with 25 miles a day. That was about as much as you really wanted to do on an ongoing basis. Getting to Parker's Ferry and doing all that movement around there that he did, plus fighting the battle. Now he goes back to St. Stephen's. A week later, he goes over to Utah Springs. He's in charge of the first line of the South Carolina militia and the North Carolina militia at the Battle of Utah Springs. Successfully leads that line at that battle. He also has to reorganize militia into 2 divisions. Rutledge wanted to see him, so he has to march to the high hills to see Rutledge and back. And that's about somewhere around an 85-mile ride, something like that. He's got to try and there's rumors that Cornwallis may be coming back into South Carolina. So now he's got to worry about, and if Cornwallis will be coming back, he's coming back through Wilmington and then down around through Georgetown potentially. So now he has to try and go out and find somebody to help to defend that eventuality. Plus, he's got to deal with the 2 state cavalry regiments under Peter O'Ree and Hezekiah Mahan, 2 commanders who butt heads pretty much constantly and continue to do so throughout the war. So I get tired just thinking about the things that Francis Marion had to do. And the other thing that gave me just an unbelievably greater sense of the breadth of this man's responsibility and his skills, and truly, he did so much just to hold South Carolina together. It just boggles my mind. Rutledge, while all this is going on, Rutledge has his new ideas that Marion will have to put into place. Rutledge is ready to reestablish your legislature. So he calls for elections for the General Assembly so they can meet in January. And of course, who's gonna take care of being the guy that carries out the elections? Francis Marion, Brigadier General, in charge of carrying out all the military actions north of Charlestown. And oh, by the way, you're going to direct all the elections in South Carolina and make sure that people can get to the elections. You can see Marion wasn't too excited about the whole idea. He wrote, "I am sorry to see this business so soon entered on, as I am clear the elections cannot be full." Wasn't too optimistic. Man, a part of the not being full implied that obviously the British controlled Charlestown and the outlying islands there, so any elections with those dealing with Charlestown, there wouldn't be too many people voting for the senators and the representatives from Charlestown and those islands, because guess what? They're in Charlestown and those islands, and they won't be coming out to vote. And certainly the British are not going to allow us to come into Charlestown and elect our senators and representatives to come to Jacksonville. That wasn't going to happen. Now we have to figure out where we're going to meet. Of course, General Greene comes back into play here. Greene wants, initially the plan was to go to Camden, figuring that it was out of the way, there wouldn't be any problems. We can have our elections, we can go to the Assembly, we can send them a peace, there should not be any issues. Greene, however, felt that Jacksonboro would be the best place to meet. His reasons were numerous. I think he indicated he could better protect the Assembly if it were a Jacksonboro, because he felt that the militia, the loyalist militia around Camden, might cause havoc, because he wasn't going to be taking his Continental Army up to protect the Assembly. I think that may have been a smokescreen as far as his explanation goes. I think that the real reason why he, wanted it Jacksonboro was this concept that Chris Swager mentioned last night. I don't know Latin very well, so I don't know it at all, as a matter of fact, except when I was an older boy. But Uti Posidetis is that concept that Chris mentioned last night, which says that when you're going to, let's say, a peace table, that the tendency is that you're going to receive the property that you control as part of the peace treaty. In other words, if you're controlling Jacksonboro, if you're at Jacksonboro, you're controlling it, that will be yours when the treaty is signed. Whereas if you met up in Camden, you're not demonstrating that you control that lower part of South Carolina. So the intent here is show that you control it, then you can keep it. And that was Greene's main point. Thus leaving only Charlestown and those islands as the only points of contention once they got to any peace treaties. Now, just to give you an indication, Jacksonboro, Charlestown, we're talking about 36 miles. That's not very far. Obviously, it's more than a day's ride, but compared to where Camden is, it's a pretty short distance. Greene at that time was up at Round Up. So we're going to meet at Jacksonboro. Well, Rutledge agreed to that. 10 days later, he writes back, says, "Yeah, let's meet at Jacksonboro." And Greene says, "Yeah, that's not going to work. Sorry. We need to change it back to Camden. We got all these British reinforcements are coming in. I don't know if I can support you, so you better move it back to Camden." Don't forget, we're dealing here with letters that are passing back and forth. As we know, it's not like our U.S. Postal Service where you can get it the next day or the day following. These letters are taking a little time to get there. So on New Year's Eve, Rutledge writes and says, what did I do? He didn't say that. But no, maybe he did, come to think of it. Basically, he said it's too late to change. We're on December 31st, we're going to meet January 8th. We can't change this thing. But he realized that Jacksonville was doubtful because of the reinforcement situation. And he suggested, well, maybe we will have to move it back to Camden. So his letter goes out. Greene's letter, writes his letter, which comes in to Rutledge saying that he thinks we should meet at Jacksonboro after all. because the reinforcements aren't as great, so let's go ahead and meet at Jacksonboro. No problem. So eventually, at that point in time, the dice gets too late anyhow. I mean, these guys they're talking back and forth, but there's nothing that they can do at this point in time anyhow. But by January 2nd, Marion, our friend Marion, responsible for sending out the announcements that the assembly is going to meet. It's going to meet in 6 days. So now we're going to meet in Jacksonboro on January the 8th. I'm sending these proclamations out all over South Carolina. And let's see. And the email server was down. And as a result, it's going to take a few days to get these announcements out to the various people who have been elected. And of course, they're going to have to then come back into Jacksonboro. But you have 6 days to get all this done. That really shouldn't be much of a problem in this information age. But meanwhile, don't forget we have Francis Marion running around. Just to show you that he wasn't just sending out notices and just kind of hanging around waiting for the assembly to start. Francis Marion is busy as he has ever been in this period between December 19th to January 11th. And if you see, I'll just show you a couple, just indication that Marion was being stretched really, really thin. The red line gives an indication of an 85-mile jump that he made. And you can see up at the top of Monk's Corner, and down there, you can see down where Dorchester is. Greene ordered Marion to come to Dorchester because there was an indication that the British were going to come out in full force to attack Greene. Now we're talking about a few days before a couple weeks before our assembly is going to meet. Marion, being the man that he is, he makes a mad dash, but he takes a circuitous route. You can see he's going around, he's going through that circular around here. I believe this is Cypress Swamp. He comes down into Dorchester, and this is, once again, this is not a ride you're just kind of making a day or so. I mean, this is pretty hard riding because there aren't really any roads through here to speak of. There weren't then anyhow. So once he gets to Dorchester and he camps here, Greene says, just kidding, there's no, the threat's gone. So Marion, I'm sure he was pretty well frustrated by that, turns around and he just heads right back up to where he was up here at Robert Quash's plantation. And then a few days later, Marion still has nothing to do. So he says, well, let's just we're going to move our guys up here to Wamba. This is probably up to, I believe, Durant's plantation or thereabouts. And that's another 40-mile run. So here we go for about another 3-week period. Marion's making another 120-mile run. I don't know how many horses he goes through. I mean, I imagine he'd have to be going through horse after horse. It'd be crazy. So that's up to January 11th. So you can see the legislature's supposed to meet January 8th. January 11th, he's still sitting up here way up here by the Santee. What happened? Oh, I lost my clicker here. George, I'm like the remote's not working. There we go. This is a quick shot of Jacksonboro. It's probably not the best shot, but if you know the area, this is 17 coming in right here, and coming down. This is the original layout of Jacksonboro. We have a plat that shows it, the 1780 plat. I was going to show it, but once you see it, it just looks like unfortunately, it looks like a lot of chicken scratching, so I just pulled it out. Happening again, George. There we go. But finally, after all this going on, the General Assembly finally convenes on January 8th. Unfortunately, nobody shows. Well, not too many people show anyhow. We have 17 members of the House, and we have 5 members of the Senate show. I think the Senate had a total of 25 elected, and it seems like the House had, I don't know, like 200 or something like that. Some unbelievable number of representatives. Marion, as we saw, didn't show because on January 11th he was still sitting up at Wamba. And from the 9th to the 13th, there's no Marion, and there's no quorum in the Senate, and there's no quorum in the House. So our House we were going to convene on January 8th, And by the 5 days later, still nothing going on. Is that me, George, or you? Marion finally gets his brigade together. I guess he probably delayed as long as he could. So he winds up making an 85-mile ride, leaving on the 11th from Wamba, coming all the way down, and he makes it in Jacksonboro in about 2 days. And that's quite a hike, another 85-mile ride by this old guy. Of course, he probably did not look like this when he arrived at Jacksonboro. That's my suspicion. But he did make it on the 14th, and nobody was there anyhow. At least there wasn't a quorum there anyhow. And for whatever reason, on the 15th, he didn't show. He was probably too tired and probably was just trying to get some rest. But finally, on the 16th, Marion was present at the meeting of the Senate. Finally, on the 17th, the House reached its quorum, and the 18th, the Senate finally reached a quorum. Now we have the House of Representatives meeting in the Masonic Lodge in Jacksonboro, because there were no public buildings in Jacksonboro. It was a town of maybe 60 houses. And we have the Senate meeting in a bar, Dubois Tavern. Makes for some interesting legislation, I would think. Anthony Allaire described Jacksonboro. Allaire was a Loyalist lieutenant, but it's interesting to see his description. He called it a village containing about 60 houses situated on the Pond or Edisto River. And most of the houses are very good, the people tolerable well to live, some large storehouses for rice, from which they convey it by water to Charlestown. Kind of a vanilla type description, but that's what we have. Charles mentioned Edward McCready earlier as the one who wrote a 2-volume history of South Carolina in the Revolution, the early 1900s. McCready probably summed up the meeting of the legislators the best that I have seen. And he wrote, "The assemblage was remarkable because it was the first in which there had been real representatives in the legislature from all parts of the state. In this body, Sumter and Pickens and Taylor and Lacey and Wynn and the Hamptons and Hammonds appeared, and brought with them from the up country, which their swords had redeemed, as much weight in council as that which had hitherto been carried by the Rutledges, Pinckneys, Middletons, and others of the low country." Significance here is that for the first time in South Carolina's history, the back country really had some power. And the other sense, if you think about it, is that the backcountry legislators could come to Jacksonboro. However, there were a number of the low country legislators that couldn't get there because they, for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, some of them weren't there. But in essence, that even gave the backcountry even more, I'll call it power, more power. Once the houses were convened, the Senate joined the House at that Masonic Lodge, and Rutledge gave his review, and he summarized the past 2 years. I think his words are to me, were pretty intense. That the British officers have tarnished the glory of the British arms and fixed indelible stigmas on the British name. He's blaming the whole war on the officers of the British Army as opposed to the British soldiers or the British politicians, which I thought was kind of curious that he wouldn't pick on a politician, probably because he himself is a politician. But he also indicated that he presumed, throwing some caution here, that the British would attempt to hold Charleston and make another effort to subjugate the country. He then turned his attention to some of the new legislation that he felt needed to be accomplished very quickly. And you can read it as soon as, I didn't do that time, by the way. There we go. Basic things that they really had to do. He concluded, and I think this is a very good pretty good statement from Rutledge as a conclusion to his. This is probably the last thing that Rutledge officially said to the Assembly since he was the outgoing governor. And he said, "The interest and honor, the safety and happiness of our country depend so much on the result of your deliberations that I flatter myself you will proceed in the weighty business before you with firmness and temper, with vigor, unanimity, and dispatch. Hopefully that cheerleading did the job for them. A few days later, Christopher Gadsden was elected governor, which probably that was a surprise to me that the legislature elected Christopher Gadsden. But Gadsden decided that he wasn't up for that task. His health was not the best in the world because he had been imprisoned in St. Augustine in solitary confinement for the last, well, a year and a half almost. So he was not in the best of shape. So the legislature, General Assembly, elected John Matthews, the governor of Jacksonboro. And I think you mentioned earlier that he was a member of the Continental Congress. And curiously, there was a John Matthews who sold Marion his Palm Bluff plantation. I don't know if it's the same Matthews or not, but I found it just kind of curious that name would pop up there as well. Some quick names of the who's who of South Carolina. The Privy Council included Gadsden and Edward Rutledge. And we see our friend Thomas Sumter was elected, but he declined. I don't know why. It may have been something to do with issues with his Sumter's Law being repealed. To the Continental Congress went John Rutledge and Arthur Middleton. Arthur Middleton, by the way, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And of course, dealing with Middleton Place, part of the family anyhow. The Senate, just some names: Marion, Thomas Sumter, John Lewis Gervais, those are all familiar. House of Representatives was filled with Thomas Hayward Jr., another Declaration of Independence. We're dealing with John Lawrence, Moultrie, Charles Cosworth Pinckney, who will tell us all about his experiences tonight. And we also have the Rutledge boys. You and Edward and John were all members of the House. Henry Lawrence was also elected, but he did not show. He was a little too busy across the water. After this